cover today's topic, which is about the extraocular muscles and the movements of the eye. This is one of the most complex topics, or let's just say that a lot of people have difficulties with this topic. Basically, here you have two ways how you can approach this topic. You can choose the path to just simply mindlessly, without trying to understand it, you try to memorize the functions of the extraocular muscles and the eye movements. This, on the first approach, first sight, might look easier. You might think that this way it takes a shorter time to study this topic, but then after the first few questions in the exam, you will get confused for sure, and you can only pray for that you answered the questions of the examiners correctly. The other way is when you try to understand and try to recreate the movements of the eyes with understanding the principles in the background. This takes a lot more effort from you, but on the long run, this method will do you more good. So I will try to point out those important things which will make you be able to understand the principles, how the eyes are moved by the surrounding muscles, and how you can learn it for longer periods, so you can understand and then recreate the movements for yourselves. So what muscles are we talking about? You have altogether 6 muscles which are inserting on the eye, more precisely on the sclera. And you also have another extra muscle in the area inside the orbit, which does not really belong to the eye muscles, but it shares the innervation with the eye muscles. So you have 4 rectus muscles, a superior, a medial, an inferior, and a lateral rectus muscle. The complete name is rectus bulbi superior muscle, rectus bulbi medialis, but if you refer to them as just rectus medialis or rectus inferior and so on, that's perfectly fine. The abbreviations either RS, so rectus superior, or you can also turn it around and say superior rectus, so SR or RS, it does not matter. It's up to you, personal preference. I use the RS because if you call it rectus superior muscle, then that's the obvious abbreviation of that. Okay, so that was the reason why I use these abbreviations here. And you also have 2 oblique muscles, where you have a superior oblique muscle or oblique superior muscle and an inferior oblique muscle, abbreviated into OS and OI here. An important thing, as a side note, but it's an important thing, that here you have in the anterior top corner of the orbit, you have this little part here you call the trochlea, where the superior oblique muscle passes through, and its tendon here goes to the eyeball through this loop, through this trochlea. So that's an important thing. And the 7th muscle, this extra muscle which I was mentioning, is the levator palpebrae superior muscle, which is responsible for opening the eye by pulling the superior eyelid. Origin of the muscles. The origin of the muscles, most of the muscles, actually there is only one exception, that's the inferior oblique. So all other muscles, including the rectus muscles, all of the 4 rectus muscles and the superior oblique together with the levator palpebrae superioris muscle, have a common tendinous ring here surrounding the optic canal and the superior orbital fissure medial part. You don't require all these nerves, so the position of the nerves, you don't need to know that. You just have to know which nerves and which arteries, which veins pass through these different openings of the skull. You don't have to know the relationship between the tendinous ring, the muscles, and the nerves. They are just there for a complete picture there. Okay, so you have this tendinous ring, so that's where the muscles are originating from. Next, the insertion of the muscles has to be considered. So, first of all, the rectus lateralis muscle. So that inserts here in the anterior part of the eyeball in the lateral area. So lateral anterior quadrant. In the first lecture about the eye, we talked about these divisions of the eyeball into octants. So you have the three possible directions, three possible planes along which you can halve the eyeballs. So along a frontal or coronal plane, you have an anterior and a posterior part. Horizontally, you have a superior and an inferior part. And by cutting the eyeball in the sagittal plane, you have a medial portion and the lateral portion. And if you combine all these three, you have altogether 8 pieces, which you call octants. In case of the rectus muscles, only quadrants make sense because the rectus muscles have their insertion exactly in these planes. So the lateral and medial rectus muscles are located at the exact level of the horizontal plane or horizontal meridian of the eyeball. So they are anteriorly in between the medial superior or medial inferior in case of the medial rectus, or the lateral superior and the lateral inferior anterior octants. So only quadrants make sense here. Short to say, so lateral anterior quadrant is the lateral rectus, and the medial anterior quadrant is the medial rectus muscle. This means that they are exactly in the horizontal plane, that they have no other possible movements. They can move the eyeball around longitudinal axis, so they are doing abduction, the lateral rectus, and adduction, so moving laterally or medially. So that's the only thing what they do. In case of superior rectus, it goes to the superior anterior quadrant of the eyeball, so the muscle itself has an oblique direction. Comparing the insertion point and the origin point is located more medially, more inferior because the insertion is on the top part of the eyeball. So the muscle goes from medial to lateral, from inferior to superior, and from posterior to anterior, obviously, since it's coming from the back here. So the muscle has an oblique direction. This will mean that it will have 3 different movements which it can produce with the so 3 different movements which it can produce with this oblique direction. Inferior rectus muscle is on the bottom, inserting on the bottom, so the inferior anterior quadrant. So comparing its insertion to its origin, you can say that the muscle is moving from posterior to anterior direction, from medial to lateral, and from superior to inferior, from medial to lateral, and from the back to the front. Again, just like with the superior rectus muscle, this will have an oblique direction, oblique muscle. Basically, even though it is called rectus, it is still running obliquely, and this will produce again 3 different movements, one around each possible axis. Then let's move on to the superior and inferior obliques. Here the names are not misleading, they are called oblique just like their directions. First of all, the superior oblique. So here the muscle belly is located in this area. It is going straight from the back to the front, but because of the trochlea and its relation to the tendon, so you should pick the trochlea as the actual origin of the tendon, which is in front, medially, and superiorly, compared to the insertion point, which is in the superior posterior lateral octant. Okay, so the tendon comes from the front to the back, from medial to lateral, and from superior to inferior direction to the top of the eyeball, so superior posterior lateral octant. Inferior oblique, as the name suggests, it's inferior, anterior, and medially is the origin, whereas the insertion is in the inferior posterior lateral octant of the eyeball. So it goes this way. It goes from anterior to posterior, from medial to lateral, and from below, so from inferior direction, goes superiorly to the bottom of the surface of the eyeball. Okay? So in order to understand the functions, you have to keep these following major points in your mind. So the eye is a spheroid object, and the movement, all of the movements which it does, is basically rolling. In all possible directions, it can roll like a ball. Okay? You pick the three main directions, the three main axes, and the three main planes, and you can divide the eyeball in these three directions. So you will have an anterior part of the eyeball, you will have a posterior part of the eyeball when you cut the eye in a coronal section. You can have the top and the bottom parts, superior and inferior, if you cut the eyeball horizontally. And if you cut it sagittally, you can have medial and lateral halves. Because of the rolling, these move always together, but the different parts, so anterior and posterior, superior and inferior, medial and lateral, will always move in opposite directions. If the anterior part is moving downwards, then the posterior part is moving opposite upwards. Okay, so you have to keep this in mind. Also, you have these 4 quadrants and 8 octants. And a key thing to understand the movements, you have, since it's a spheroid object, so how can we name these movements? What should we call the different movements? You have to pick a point of reference, the movement of which point should be considered as the name of the movement. And the important thing is that it is not necessarily the same point, this reference point is not the same and not necessarily even moving the same direction as the insertion of the muscle. So you always have to consider which way the insertion of the muscle does move and in what relationship does it have with the movements of the reference point. I can only hope that you clearly got the message of this. Okay, so as we move on, so we have to point out this point of reference. This reference point is located here in the anterior part of the eye, right above the pupil. So it is located in the anterior superior quadrant, right between the medial and the lateral part of the eye. Okay, so this is the point of reference. If this point is moving to medial direction by the movements of the eye, this movement is called the adduction. If it is moving towards lateral direction, then it's the abduction of the eye. If the point of reference is moving upwards, that's you call elevation. And if it's moving downwards, that's the depression. Moreover, you can also have rotational movements, when the eye is rotating laterally or medially. In lateral rotation, this point of reference is moving this way, so lateral rotation like this, or this way. For this particular example, this is counterclockwise, the lateral, and clockwise is medial rotation. But if we pick the other eye, this is basically according to the relation. So if this is the medial side and viewed from the front, then this should be the right eye. Obviously, for the left eye, it's the other way around. So clockwise, counterclockwise only makes sense if you pick one eye, which is at this moment the right, and view it from the front. Then this clockwise, counterclockwise only makes sense this way. Okay, so if it's much better if you don't use clockwise, counterclockwise at all. Instead, you should use reference point moving medially, that's medial rotation, and moving laterally, that's lateral rotation. Okay. So after this, we can discuss the functions of the muscles. We will start with rectus medialis and rectus lateralis because these are the most simple ones. First of all, so rectus medialis moves this point closer to this point. That means that around a longitudinal axis, this anterior part, which contains the point of reference, is moving this way. It's moving medially, so the eye will do adduction when you move your rectus medialis muscle. On the contrary, rectus lateralis goes here laterally, so it does the abduction. Simple as that. These are the simplest movements or muscles of the eye. Rectus superior muscle, since it, even though the name is rectus, it has an oblique direction. It moves the eye around all of the axes. Since the muscle, so the origin and the insertion, are related like that, that here you have anteriorly, superiorly, its insertion point. It is located right above the point of reference, which means that they will move in the same direction. So we can ignore the or cut this part to compare the origin to the reference point because they are on the same part of the eye. So since the muscle is going from medial to lateral, from its origin to its insertion, so around a longitudinal axis from medial to lateral, which way does it move the eye? It turns it medially, so it does adduction. The anterior part, so it moves this way. This muscle, if it shortens, then this point will be pulled upwards. This will mean elevation, so it does elevation. Then, around a sagittal axis, it will move this point again to this direction, medially. Okay? And that's why it will produce medial rotation. Okay? So, three movements around a transverse axis, it does elevation, longitudinal axis, adduction, sagittal axis, medial rotation, because the muscle is coming from medial to lateral. That's how you can explain the medial rotation and adduction portions. Rectus inferior, it goes to the inferior part of the eye, so anterior inferior part. This will mean that if you pull this point closer to this, the eyeball will rotate downwards, so it will produce depression. Since again it goes from medial to lateral, it also does adduction, and it will pull this inferior part towards medial direction. But because the point of reference is on the top part, that point of reference will be moved laterally because of the two parts of the eye, so superior part and the inferior part around this axis will move in the opposite directions, so it will produce a lateral rotation. With text, it's much more complicated. When we finish with this slide, I will show you this little ball I have with me in a big screen. So I will explain this another time so you can catch up with me. Okay, then these were the rectus muscles. The superior oblique and inferior oblique are even more complex than the rectus superior and rectus inferior muscles. So superior oblique, its true origin, its tendon's true origin should be considered to be the trochlea. So it's coming from the top, anterior, no, back, from superior, anterior, and medial, goes to the lateral superior posterior octant of the eye. So the tendon is going from medial to lateral, from top to bottom, so downwards, and from the front to the back. This means that if you pull this point towards this point, the back of the eye will move medially around a longitudinal axis. But since the back of the eye moves the opposite way than the front part, the anterior part of the eye, so it will move the anterior part of the eye with the point of reference towards lateral direction. This will mean that the superior oblique will not produce adduction, even though this point will be pulled medially. But if this point moves this way, then this point moves this way. So you follow the arrow direction here, it will produce abduction. Again, from the front to the back, so it will move this point that way. But again, this is on the opposite side of the eye surface than the point of reference. So if you move the back of the eye upwards, then the front part, the anterior part of the eyeball, moves downwards. This means that the oblique superior will result, so if the oblique superior is functioning, this will result in the depression of the eye. If this point is put medially, that will produce medial rotation since you move the top part of the eyeball medially. Reference point is also on the superior part, so they are moving the same direction. So oblique superior has medial rotation as third movement or third component of movements. Inferior oblique, again, from the front to the back, from inferior to superior direction to the bottom of the eye, it is still more superior than the origin of the muscle, and so from the front to the back, from medial to lateral, and from down goes upwards to the posterior lateral inferior octant of the eyeball. So if you move this point closer to this point, this will be moved downwards. This means that the anterior part with the point of reference moves upwards, so inferior oblique has elevation. If you move this point medially, then you produce abduction, so lateral movement of the anterior part, so it is again doing abduction as second. And if you rotate this point closer to this, then it will produce opposite way movement of the point of reference, so you have lateral rotation as the third. So it is very complicated, I know that. It takes quite a lot of effort thinking about it, and lot of work from you to understand this, but this is the correct way how you can make sense of all your learning this topic. Okay, so when the muscle is contracting, it will pull the insertion towards its origin. That's clear. First, you should determine the movement according to the axis, so which direction you want to consider first. Relate it, then relate the movement of the insertion point to the reference point. And the movement of the eye always means that movement of this reference point. So if that is moving to the lateral direction, then you call it lateral rotation and abduction. If it's moving medially, then you call it adduction and or medial rotation. So that's the important thing. And if the point of reference is on the same side, so if the insertion is anterior and the point of reference is also anterior, then they are moving the same direction. Or in case of the rotations, if you consider top part, so superior part, inferior part, again, they are moving in the same direction or in the opposite direction if they are located on the opposite sides. So that's one thing which you should consider. Okay, before moving on and talking about how the muscles function in combination with each other, I want to show you this little ball. So right now, as I turned off screen sharing, you should see me and this little ball in my hand in big picture. So there, this is the eye. You should not mind the text and the arrow directions first. You should only consider that this larger black spot, that's representing the pupil. And on top of that, this second darker, smaller point, that's the point of reference. So this is always on top of the pupil. Okay, so that's the point of reference. M says medial, L is lateral, so this is medial side, this is lateral side of the eye. So first of all, you should consider these movements. So this here, when I turn the eye this way, so towards medial, that's the adduction. If I rotate it this way, that's abduction. If I do this movement, that's elevation. If you do this movement, that is called depression. Another thing which you will require is this line. That's the equator of the eye. So this is the half point or line of the eyeball in the coronal plane. So this here is the back side now of the eye, and this is the front. So if I am moving the eye this way, see, the point of reference moves upwards on the anterior side. So that's elevation. But the back side of the eye, so this part is moving down like this. Okay, so it's like this. And the other way around, if I am moving this part downwards, this part is going up like this. Okay. Hope you can see and follow it clearly. All right. So first of all, let's have the rectus medialis muscle. So right now I am putting my arm onto this part, that's the rectus medialis muscle. And if I am pulling it this way, then I have pure adduction. Rectus lateralis on the other side, like this, clearly. Okay, then let's make the superior rectus muscle. So medial rectus, lateral rectus, easy pie. Now my arm, forearm and hand are representing the superior rectus muscle. So the insertion is located medially behind the eye. If I am moving this part, then first of all, around a transverse axis, I am producing elevation like that. Around the longitudinal axis, if I am moving this point closer to this point, I am doing a adduction, an adduction movement. And again, if I am moving this point closer to this around the sagittal axis, I will do rotation of the eye this way. You should clearly see how the point of reference is rotating medially. So that's the medial rotation done by the superior rectus muscle. Inferior rectus muscle, like this. Again, from this part to that part. So from medial to lateral. And if I am moving this point like that, you produce first a depression, then adduction, because the insertion and the origin are like this. So insertion is more lateral than the origin. And the rotation, if you move this part medially, then this part, since they are on the opposite sides, If this part is moved this way, you should see now if this point, the insertion, is moving medially, then the point of reference is moving laterally, so the inferior rectus muscle will do lateral rotation. Superior and inferior oblique. For the superior oblique, we should turn this eyeball this way a little bit, so you can see that is the posterior lateral superior octant where the muscle is inserting, and this way comes the tendon. So from medially, oh no, this way. Problem is that I am covering it a little bit. Okay, and here you see the point of reference. So if you move this point like that, you will have what movement of the point of reference? Depression. So superior oblique is doing with this pull, so backside of the eye forward, will produce depression of the point of reference, so that way. If I am pulling this point medially, then that point around a longitudinal axis will move laterally. So it goes with depression and abduction. Rotation, if I am moving this point medially, since both are on top of the eye, that part will do medial rotation. So superior oblique does depression, abduction, and medial rotation. Inferior oblique like this. Okay. So by moving this point that way around the transverse axis, it will do elevation of the point of reference. If I am moving this point this way, because that's how the muscle go, like this, then I will have again abduction. So by moving the backside of the eye medially, I am rotating the anterior side laterally, so it does again abduction. And if I am rolling the eye around the sagittal axis like this, so because the muscle is located like this inferior part with the insertion is rotating, moving medially, then the top part with the point of reference will move the opposite direction laterally, so it will have again lateral rotation movement. So inferior oblique does elevation, abduction, and lateral rotation. Okay, now I am giving back the slide to you. That's it. So if you consider that the eyeball should move in straight lines, you can have vertical eye movements, so looking up, looking down, or horizontal, looking to the left, looking to the right. So the muscles should work in the vertical direction in combination with one another. So you have to consider which muscles move the eye in the same directions in vertical. In the vertical direction. So elevation is done by rectus superior and inferior oblique. First of all, let's do the rectus superior. Since the insertion point of the rectus superior is right here, it makes no difference if you draw the directions onto the point of reference or onto the top of the eyeball. So I am using the point of reference here, this yellow dot. So you do rectus superior, moves this point that way, so this point is also moved that way. It's doing elevation. This point moves this way because the muscle comes from that way, so this direction. So it is doing adduction and medial rotation. Then consider the inferior oblique, which is also providing elevation. This is the insertion of the inferior oblique on the back side. So the back side will be moved downwards, so that's why the anterior side will move upwards, thus resulting in elevation. Then the back side is moving medially, so the anterior side of the eye is moving laterally, so you do abduction. And if this point is rotating that way, so from this direction for the right eye, so from front, viewed from the front, the back side of the eye here is there, so the inferior area is rotating counterclockwise, then counterclockwise direction is this way for the reference point, so you do lateral rotation. If you put these arrows to these, then you see that the main direction of the movement is the same. So these facilitate each other, okay? So a stronger elevation, and the others cancel each other out. So the abduction of the oblique inferior muscle is canceling the adduction of the rectus superior. And the same thing with the rotations. The lateral rotation of inferior oblique will cancel out the medial rotation of the superior rectus. This way, it's much more easy to learn and study and learn and to memorize finally the muscle functions if you keep these combinations in mind. Okay? Let's move on to depression. So with depression, you have inferior rectus and superior oblique muscles. First, inferior rectus muscle. Here is the insertion. So on the front, but inferior part. So this point is put downwards. Reference point is also anterior, so this point will also move the downwards, so that depression. This point, front side of the eye, so anterior side, again, pulled medially. Reference point is also anteriorly, so it will be also pulled medially. So you have depression and adduction. But in rotation, they are on opposite sides, the insertion and the reference point. Reference point is up, insertion is down. Insertion, because of the direction of the muscle, is rotating this way. So again, counterclockwise direction, this way, for the right eye. Okay, so moving medially, that means that the top part of the eyeball will move laterally, including the reference point. So you have lateral rotation of that reference point. So the eye is having lateral rotation, okay, with the rectus inferior. Superior oblique. Superior oblique, so it moves the back of the eye upwards. So this means that the opposite side, the anterior part of the eyeball, will move downwards. So that means it is resulting in depression of the reference point. It moves the back side of the eye medially. So the front of the eye moves laterally. So you have an abduction of the eyeball, because always the reference point matters for the naming of the movement. And it is rotating this part medially, since both are on the top superior half of the eye. Then reference point is also moving to the inside medially. If you put these directions, these lines to here, you see again that the main directions, depressions, are adding together, facilitating one another, and the other movements are canceling each other out. So medial rotation of superior oblique cancels the lateral rotation of inferior rectus, and abduction of the superior oblique is canceling adduction of the inferior rectus muscle. So that's how they work together in the vertical direction. Horizontal directions are much more easy, because medial rectus, lateral rectus, and they have no such accessory movements which need to be cancelled by other muscles. So that's basically it. But if you want to know more or want to think about it in more detail, then actually which muscles do medial pulling, so which muscle adduction, not just the medial rectus, but the superior and inferior rectus. And superior rectus and inferior rectus also have opposite directions if you consider vertical movements and rotations. So if rectus superior, rectus inferior, and medial rectus are working together, then you have three muscles which do the adduction movements. Elevation of superior rectus will be cancelled by depression of inferior rectus, and medial rotation of superior will be cancelled by lateral rotation of inferior rectus. So again, this combination also functioning for the horizontal directions as well. And the abduction, again, three muscles are functioning in that. You have the lateral rectus and both obliques, superior and inferior oblique. And again, elevation by inferior oblique will be cancelled by depression of superior oblique, and medial rotation of superior oblique will be cancelled by the lateral rotation of the inferior oblique muscle. So all what adds together are the abductive movements of the three muscles, so superior oblique, inferior oblique, and lateral rectus. This is a little bit more advanced level, but if you are understanding the principles in the background, then you can very easily figure out these things. So you have the conjugated eye movements. With the conjugated eye movements to the right, to the left, so in the horizontal direction, you can easily skip the oblique muscles and the superior and the inferior rectus muscle. You can stick to rectus lateralis, rectus medialis. That's enough for that to produce the looking to the left, looking to the right, so all these horizontal movements, that's fine. The thing which you have to keep in mind, though, is that you have two eyes and you have these directions, so to the left, to the right. Right side is located laterally for the right eye and medially for the left eye. So this means by looking to the right, so that way, you have to use the rectus lateralis muscle of the right eye for the abduction and the rectus medialis of the left eye for the adduction. So that way both eyes look to the right. To the left is the other way around. So for the left, you have the left rectus lateralis and the right rectus medialis muscle, which has to work together. Looking up, you have rectus superior, obliquus inferior, as seen before. Downward, again, rectus inferior, obliquus superior. Discuss that. And the last type of conjugated movements where the two eyes move together, if when you are focusing on a close object, then you have convergence. So rectus medialis on both sides have to work together. These have to be taken into consideration when you are learning the topic for the regulation of eye movement and the pathways for the eye movement, which we are not going to cover in today's lecture. However, if you check the PDF, you will have supplementary tables for that. Okay, so innervation. We did not talk about innervation of these muscles yet, and that will be the final thing which I am going to discuss with you today. So you have the oculomotor nerve, which will divide into a superior and an inferior branch, and this will innervate most of the muscles. So superior, inferior rectus, medial rectus, and the inferior oblique are all innervated by the oculomotor nerve, and also this extra muscle, accessory muscle, the levator palpebrae superioris muscle is also innervated by oculomotor nerve, even though it is not considered strictly an eye muscle. but does not matter, still innervated. Trochlear nerve will innervate which muscle? Well, the one which has the trochlea, so superior oblique. And the abducent will innervate the muscle which is doing the abduction of the eye, so that's the lateral rectus. Okay? So innervation is also not that complicated if you consider that the muscles and the muscles functions and the anatomical relations, and then the nerves can be figured out very easily, actually.
Doctor,
Yeah,
you said the abducens nerve would innervate the muscle that
rectus.
do abduction, yeah?
Yeah.
Uh,
The
the,
main abductor, which is the rectus lateralis. So that's the thing. Yeah. Okay. The other muscles, which so the two obliques, which are helping, just supporting, facilitating the abduction movement of the rectus lateralis, can be ignored in this even though you can actually have this cowork of muscles. That is a minor thing. The important thing, which are always and have to work together in order to avoid any deviation of the direction of the eyeball, are these vertical movements. So superior oblique has to always work together with the inferior rectus to look down, and so on. Okay, so that's fine with you, right?
yes, thank
Okay,
you, doctor.
okay, you're welcome. All right. So this was for today's talk. In the next things, so I'm not going to talk about this. You have several slides containing information about the regulation of coordinated voluntary eye movements. So all these slides. But right now, I'm not going to talk about that because this would require your pre-existing knowledge about brainstem and brain and things like that. So I'm just leaving these things here for you. It's in the downloadable PDF, so it's in there, and that explains a little bit about the regulation of eye movements. Okay, so that was it for today. Thank you very much.